My granddaughter didn't realize that when she began practicing her concerned face in my hallway mirror, I was watching her through the crack in the study door. She was adjusting her expression, tucking away the greed, pulling up a mask of tragic sympathy, preparing to tell the world that her grandmother's mind was a fading garden. What she didn't know was that while she was rehearsing her testimony, I was already deciding which of her secrets would be read aloud in open court. Most people see a 70-year-old black woman and see a sunset. They never suspect they're looking at a solar eclipse. I sat in my high-backed wing chair, the leather cool against my spine, holding a cup of Earl Grey that had long since gone cold. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic thump-thump of Maya's heels in the foyer. She thought she was the hunter. She thought this house, built by my husband's sweat and my own ironclad budgeting, was already hers. She'd even started bringing around a decorator, a man who looked at my mahogany sideboards as if they were firewood. "Grandma," she called out, her voice pitching into that high, infantile register people use for the very young and the very old. "Are you in there? It's getting dark. Nana, you forgot the lights again." I didn't turn the lamp on. I preferred the shadows. "They are honest. The eyes adjust, Maya," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "It's the sudden glare that blinds people." She stepped into the room, silhouetted by the hallway light. She looked successful. The tailored suit, the sharp bob, the expensive perfume that smelled like artificial lilies. It was the uniform of a woman who had spent the last 3 years embezzling from the family trust I'd spent 40 years protecting. She thought I hadn't noticed the administrative fees or the property maintenance costs that didn't match the peeling paint on the guest house. "We need to talk," she said, sitting on the edge of the ottoman, careful not to let her suit wrinkle. "The bank called. They're worried about your recent, erratic transfers. And the neighbors, Nana, they say you've been talking to the Roses again. I've spoken to a specialist, a very nice man. He thinks a quiet environment would be best for your transition." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the ghost of the little girl I used to bake peach cobbler for. But that girl had been starved out by a woman who valued a zip code over a bloodline. She was using the oldest trick in the book, the crazy old woman narrative. It's a convenient cage, easy to build and hard to escape once the door is locked by a judge's gavel. "An irregularity, you say?" I mused, tilting my head. I let a small, practiced tremor touch my hand as I reached for my tea. I saw her eyes jump to the movement, a flash of triumph crossing her face. "Got her. My memory isn't what it used to be. True. But I do remember the way your father spoke about integrity. I wonder, would your specialist find it erratic that I've moved the entirety of the liquid assets into a private holding, or would he just find it prudent?" The triumph vanished. For a second, the room grew colder than the tea. She didn't know I'd spent the last 6 months documenting every dinner, every loan, and every whispered phone call she made from my kitchen. She thought she was playing checkers, but I've been playing a grandmaster's game since before her mother went into labor. You moved the money?" Her voice lost its sweetness. It was sharp now, a serrated blade. "Grandma, you can't do that. You're not in the right headspace. This is exactly why I filed the emergency petition. The hearing is Tuesday. I didn't want it to come to this, but you're a danger to your own legacy." I stood up slowly, making sure she saw every inch of my height. I may be 70, but my spine is made of the same steel that survived Jim Crow and the glass ceilings of the Board of Education. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the Persian rug. "Tuesday," I repeated softly. "A fine day for a reckoning. You should wear the blue suit, Maya. It makes you look trustworthy. But remember this, a legacy isn't just money. It's the truth. And the truth has a funny way of coming out when you're standing in front of a judge who remembers exactly who taught him how to read." I watched her face go pale, the first seed of doubt finally taking root in her expensive soil. She hadn't bothered to check the roster for the probate circuit. She hadn't bothered to see which of my former students now wore the black robes. "Get out of my house, Maya," I said, the Nana persona falling away like dead skin. "And make sure you're on time for court. I'd hate for you to miss the opening statement." As she scurried out, the heels of her shoes clicking a frantic, desperate retreat, I went back to my chair. The game was no longer a secret. The board was set. She thought she was dragging me into a trap, but she was really just walking herself into a cage I'd been building since the first time she lied about the price of my groceries. The morning after Maya's visit, the house felt lighter, as if the walls themselves were exhaling the tension she'd left behind. I woke at 5 a.m., a habit from 30 years of ensuring my students were met with a prepared mind and a sharp pencil. I didn't need an alarm. The sun rising over the oak trees in the backyard was my internal clock. I sat at my vanity, brushing my hair with the silver-backed brush my husband, Elijah, gave me for our 25th anniversary. 70 years of life are etched into my face, lines of laughter, lines of grief, and the deep, permanent grooves of a woman who has spent a lifetime observing the world from the periphery. Maya thinks those lines are a map of exhaustion. She sees the silver in my hair and assumes the iron in my will has rusted. She's young. She hasn't yet learned that the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes has stopped paying attention. I walked down to the kitchen, the floorboards greeting me with familiar creaks. I moved to the pantry, shifting a heavy bag of flour to reveal the small, fireproof floor safe hidden beneath the linoleum. Maya had spent weeks scouring my desk and my filing cabinets, looking for the discrepancies she hoped to present in court. She'd found exactly what I wanted her to find, a series of confusing, handwritten ledgers that suggested a mind struggling to keep its accounts straight. What she hadn't found, and what she never would, was the secondary set of books. I pulled out the blue leather binder. This was the real history of the last 3 years. In it, I had meticulously taped every emergency receipt Maya had presented to me. The $4,000 for her transmission that never actually broke down. The $6,000 for a medical bill from a clinic that didn't exist. The $12,000 investment in a tech startup that was actually just a down payment on her luxury sedan. Beside each receipt, I had pasted the bank statements showing the withdrawals, followed by the private investigators' reports I'd commissioned using a small, untraceable account Elijah had set up for me decades ago, just in case. The investigator, a man named Mr. Henderson, one of the first boys I ever taught to read, had been very thorough. He'd captured photos of Maya at the casino, at high-end boutiques, and at the dealership, all on the same days she'd sat at my kitchen table weeping about her struggles. "Patience, Elnora," I whispered to myself, using the name only Elijah used. Patience is a weapon. I heard a car pull into the gravel driveway. I didn't rush. I replaced the safe lid, moved the flour back into place, and walked to the stove to put the kettle on. By the time the doorbell rang, the kitchen smelled of peppermint tea and quiet resolve. It wasn't Maya. It was her lawyer, a man named Arthur. Not my banker Arthur, but a sharp-jawed young man with a suit that cost more than a teacher's yearly pension. He looked at me with that same tragic sympathy Maya had practiced. It's a look designed to make the recipient feel small, fragile, and ultimately irrelevant. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "I'm Arthur Pendergast. I represent your granddaughter. We're just here to serve the formal papers for the hearing on Tuesday. We're also requesting a preliminary walkthrough of the property to assess its condition for the transition." I didn't step back. I stood in the center of my hallway, a woman in a floral housecoat facing a man in pinstripes. "The property's condition is excellent Mr. Pendergast. As is my hearing, you may leave the papers on the hall tree. As for the walkthrough, you'll find that my home is a private residence, not a showroom. Unless you have a warrant, I suggest you admire the architecture from the sidewalk. He stiffened, his professional veneer cracking just enough to show the arrogance beneath. Mrs. Jenkins, we're trying to make this easy for you. Maya is devastated that it's come to this. She loves you. Love is a verb, Mr. Pendergast, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the quietly dangerous tone that used to make even the rowdiest high school seniors fall silent. And Maya's actions have been very loud lately. Tell her I received the papers, and tell her to make sure her own books are balanced before she starts auditing mine. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He expected a confused old woman. He found a stone wall. He left the blue envelope on the table and retreated, his polished shoes crunching loudly on the gravel, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed through the morning air. I picked up the envelope and walked back to the kitchen. I didn't open it. I knew what it said. I sat back down with my tea, watching the steam rise. The trap was almost set. Maya thought she was the one holding the leash, but she'd forgotten that I was the one who taught her how to walk. Rain began to drum against the window panes of the study, a steady, rhythmic pulse that mirrored the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a Saturday, the kind of day Maya used to spend at my kitchen island, sticky-fingered and begging for extra frosting on her cupcakes. Now, that same girl was likely sitting in a glass-walled office, coaching her specialist on how to describe my deteriorating spatial awareness. I wasn't baking today. I was sitting at my husband's old roll-top desk, a piece of furniture Maya had already tagged with a mental price label. She didn't realize the desk had a false bottom, a relic of Elijah's days as a young attorney when some files were too dangerous to leave in a cabinet. I reached under the mahogany lip, triggered the spring, and pulled out a sleek, modern tablet. Digital literacy is a funny thing. People my age are expected to struggle with a TV remote, let alone a cloud-synced security network. Maya had been the one to insist I install smart cameras and a digital thermostat 3 years ago. For your safety, Nana, she'd said, her eyes gleaming with the thought of monitoring my every move from her phone. She'd set up the passwords herself, convinced I'd never bother to change them. She was right about one thing. I am a creature of habit, but she forgot that a teacher's greatest skill is learning. I hadn't just changed the passwords. I'd rerouted the admin access to a ghost server Mr. Henderson helped me set up. For 2 years, Maya had been watching a looped, pre-recorded feed of me sitting in the garden or napping in the sun whenever she logged in. Meanwhile, I had been watching the real Maya. I tapped the screen. The footage from 3 nights ago flickered to life. There was Maya standing in my very kitchen at 2 a.m., thinking I was sound asleep upstairs. She wasn't looking for medicine or checking the stove. She was going through my mail with a professional's precision, her face illuminated by the blue light of her phone as she photographed my bank statements. Looking for the gold, aren't you, little bird? I whispered to the screen. In the video, she paused, her brow furrowed. She had found the staged ledger I'd left in the drawer, the one with the scribbled notes about burying the cash under the hydrangea bush. I watched as a slow, predatory grin spread across her face. She thought she'd found the smoking gun for her incompetency hearing. She thought she'd found proof that I was losing my mind to paranoiac delusions. I swiped to the next clip. This one was from her own apartment, a feed I'd gained access to after accidentally leaving a small, high-gain receiver in her handbag during our last Christmas dinner. The audio was crisp. It's a slam dunk, Arthur. Maya's voice rang out cold and devoid of the honey she used for me. She's hidden the liquid assets. She's talking about burying money in the dirt. The judge will sign the conservatorship before lunch. Once I'm in control, we flip the house by June. That developer in Charlotte is already offering 2.5 for the acreage. I felt a coldness settle in my marrow, but it wasn't fear. It was the absolute clarity of a woman who no longer has anything to lose but her dignity. 2.5 million. That was the price of my life's work. That was the value she placed on the porch where Elijah had proposed, and the garden where we buried our old Labradors. I turned off the tablet and tucked it back into the hidden compartment. I didn't need to hear any more. The specialist Maya had hired was a man named Dr. Aris, a consultant with a history of helping wealthy heirs expedite the sidelining of their elders. I'd already looked into his credentials. He had a penchant for expensive watches and a very thin paper trail. I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror, adjusting the collar of my cardigan. I looked exactly like what they expected, a fragile, elderly woman in a quiet house. But inside, I was a storm. Tomorrow was Sunday, the day of rest. But for Maya, it would be the last day she felt the sun on her back before the shadows I'd been cultivating finally caught up to her. I had one more call to make to Mr. Henderson. There was a specific file in the county clerk's office that needed a very careful second look, a file concerning the deed to this house that Maya thought she'd already altered. Sunday morning arrived with the smell of rain-soaked earth and the distant, rhythmic tolling of the bells from St. Jude's. I dressed with more care than usual, choosing a navy silk dress and the double-strand pearls Elijah had bought me the year he made partner. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a woman who had survived 7 decades of storms by knowing exactly when to bend and when to remain a pillar of salt. As I pulled into the church parking lot, I saw Maya's silver car already parked near the entrance. She was playing her part perfectly, the devoted granddaughter escorting her failing elder to worship. She stepped out of the car. As I approached, her face a mask of weary concern that she made sure the deacon and the usher saw. "Oh, Nana, let me help you," she cooed, reaching for my elbow with a grip that was a fraction too tight, a silent command to stay in my lane. "You seemed so confused this morning. I was worried you'd forgotten where we were going." I patted her hand, my touch light and seemingly fragile. Memory is a fickle thing. Maya, it stays where it's loved and leaves where it's neglected. But I could never forget the house of the Lord, or the faces of those who think they can hide within it. She stiffened, her eyes darting to the usher, who was nodding at us with a sympathetic smile. She leaned in closer, her voice a sharp whisper against my ear. "Don't start, Grandma. Just sit through the service. We have a meeting with Dr. Aris afterward. He wants to see you in a natural environment before the hearing. Try to act present." We took our seats in the third pew. Maya spent the service checking her watch and sending silent texts, her thumb flying across the screen with a frantic energy. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the sermon on the prodigal son. It was ironic, really. Maya didn't want to return to the fold. She wanted to burn the barn down for the insurance money. After the benediction, we moved to the fellowship hall. Standing near the coffee urn was a man in a charcoal suit, looking entirely too polished for a Sunday social. Dr. Aris. He had the kind of eyes that didn't look at you, but through you as if he were already categorizing your symptoms for a billing code. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, extending a hand that felt like damp parchment. "I'm Dr. Aris. Maya has told me so much about your recent challenges. It's a brave thing, acknowledging when the shadows start to get a bit long." I looked him dead in the eye, letting the Nana mask slip just enough for him to see the abyss behind it. "The shadows are only long when the sun is setting, Doctor. But I've always preferred the moonlight. It reveals things the sun is too bright to notice. Like the fact that your medical license was under review in Georgia 3 years ago for improperly facilitated guardianship. Tell me, is the weather here more to your liking?" The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint into the pound cake. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Grandma, you're being delusional. Georgia? Doctor, I'm so sorry. She's been reading those conspiracy blogs again. I don't read blogs, Maya, I said softly, picking up a napkin and dabbing a stray crumb from the table. I read public records. They're much more reliable, especially when they involve a paper trail of kickbacks from real estate developers. I turned back to Dr. Aris, who was already looking for the nearest exit. I'll see you both on Tuesday. I've prepared a very special presentation for the court. I think you'll find it illuminating. I walked away then, my heels clicking a steady, confident beat on the linoleum. I didn't look back to see Maya's fury or the doctor's panic. I had planted the first seed of doubt, and in their world, doubt is a parasite that eats through even the thickest skin. As I reached my car, I saw Mr. Henderson waiting by the gate. He tipped his hat, a silent signal that the final piece of the puzzle, the deed transfer Maya thought she'd forged, had been intercepted. The house was too quiet on Monday evening, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. I spent the afternoon in the basement, a place Maya never ventured because of the musty smell and the steep wooden stairs. To her, it was a graveyard for old holiday decorations and Elijah's law books. To me, it was the archive of a life she couldn't comprehend. I sat at the heavy oak workbench, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Hidden behind a stack of dusty crates containing my 1984 curriculum files was a small, high-capacity shredder and a scanner. For the last 48 hours, Mr. Henderson had been funneling documents to me, digital ghosts of transactions Maya thought were erased. The most damning piece wasn't the embezzlement. It was the quiet title action she had attempted to file in a neighboring county. She had tried to claim I was a squatter in my own home using a forged signature from a dead notary. It was a bold move, the kind of arrogance that only comes from believing your opponent is already mentally vacant. My phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from an unknown number. The courier is 5 minutes out. Package 4 is ready. I walked up the stairs, my joints moving with a fluid precision that would have terrified Maya. I didn't need a cane. I used it as a prop, a rhythmic metronome to lull her into a false sense of superiority. When the doorbell rang, I found a young man in a nondescript delivery uniform holding a manila envelope. "Sign here, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of recognition. He was another one, a boy I'd helped stay in school when the streets were calling his name. The Jenkins network, as Elijah used to joke, was vast and deeply loyal. I took the envelope to the kitchen table. Inside were the certified transcripts from the Georgia Medical Board regarding Dr. Aris and a series of photographs taken 48 hours ago. They showed Maya meeting with a man in a dark SUV in the parking lot of a local strip mall. The man was a known fixer for the very development firm that wanted my acreage. In one photo, a thick envelope was being passed from the man to Maya. "Greed makes you sloppy, Maya," I whispered, the paper crinkling under my touch. "You didn't even check for the reflection in the SUV's tinted windows." I heard a key turn in the front lock. Maya. She had let herself in, her confidence restored by whatever lie Dr. Aris had told her to settle her nerves after the church incident. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes immediately landing on the manila envelope. "Still obsessing over your files, Nana?" she asked, her voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that made my skin crawl. "You know, the doctor thinks this fixation on evidence is a classic symptom of late-stage paranoia. It's okay to let go. You don't have to fight anymore." I didn't hide the envelope. I laid it flat on the table, my hand resting on top of it like a queen over a map. "Fighting is such a loud word, Maya. I prefer correcting. And as for my fixation, I've always believed that if you give a person enough rope, they'll eventually save you the trouble of tying the knot." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You're speaking in riddles again. It's sad, really. On Tuesday, the judge is going to see exactly what I see. A woman living in a past that doesn't exist anymore. Enjoy your last night in this house, Grandma. I've already booked the movers for Friday. She turned to leave, her designer heels clicking triumphantly against the hardwood. She didn't notice that I hadn't blinked. She didn't see the way I looked at the clock. Maya, I called out just as she reached the hallway. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. Yes. Make sure you get a good night's sleep, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. The courtroom has very bright lights. It's hard to hide the bags under your eyes when you're under oath. She rolled her eyes and slammed the door. I sat in the gathering dusk, the manila envelope still beneath my hand. The pieces were all on the board. The fixer, the doctor, and the devoted granddaughter. They all thought they were the players. They didn't realize they were just the pieces I was about to sweep off the table. The morning of the hearing, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a downpour that hadn't quite broken. I sat at my vanity, dressing with the surgical precision of a general preparing for a final stand. I chose a hat with a small, stiff veil, not to hide my face, but to frame the stillness of it. In this world, people see a black veil on an elderly woman and they think of mourning. They never think of a tactical mask. I didn't take a taxi. I drove myself in the 1998 sedan Elijah had kept pristine. The engine hummed, a low, mechanical growl that felt like a companion. As I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, I saw the television cameras. Maya had been busy. She'd leaked a story to the local news about a tragic struggle for a family legacy, positioning herself as the heartbroken protector of a confused matriarch. She wanted a public spectacle to ensure the judge felt the weight of public interest. She didn't realize that in a courtroom, the only interest that matters is the one sitting behind the bench. I walked up the stone steps, my cane tapping a steady, rhythmic clack, clack, clack. Maya was waiting at the top, flanked by Dr. Eris and her shark-faced lawyer, Pendergast. She wore a soft, gray dress, her hair pulled back in a modest bun, looking every bit the grieving saint. When she saw me, she rushed forward, her hands outstretched as if to steady a wobbling child. Nana, you shouldn't have driven, she cried, her voice carrying perfectly to the nearby reporters. We were so worried. Please, let us help you inside. I didn't pull away. I let her take my arm, but I leaned in close, my breath barely a ghost against her ear. The cameras are a nice touch, Maya, but remember, they record the fall just as clearly as the climb. I hope you've practiced your surprised face. It's about to get a lot of airtime. She stiffened, her grip on my arm tightening to the point of pain. You're delusional, she hissed under her breath, her saint mask never wavering for the cameras. Just keep your mouth shut and let the experts talk. By noon, I'll have the keys. We entered courtroom 4B. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and old paper. At the front of the room, the bailiff stood tall, and the court reporter was already testing her keys. I took my seat at the petitioner's table, directly across from Maya and her team. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge, Silas Vance, presiding. I felt Maya's breath hitch beside me. Silas Vance, the name I'd whispered to her at church. She looked at the bench, her eyes widening as a tall, silver-haired black man with shoulders like an oak tree took his seat. Silas didn't look at me. He didn't smile. He adjusted his glasses and opened the file with a hand that had once held the books I'd lent him 40 years ago when his family couldn't afford them. This is an emergency petition for involuntary conservatorship. Judge Vance began, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. Petitioner Maya Jenkins alleges that the respondent, Elnora Jenkins, is no longer capable of managing her affairs or her estate. Counsel, proceed. Pendergast stood up, his voice smooth and oily. He spoke of confused ledgers, erratic behavior, and concerning delusions regarding Georgian medical boards. He painted a picture of a woman lost in the fog of her own mind, a woman who needed a loving hand to guide her into the sunset. Then he called his first witness, Dr. Eris. The doctor took the stand, looking confident, his expensive watch catching the light as he adjusted his tie. He began to speak about cognitive decline and paranoid projections. He looked at me with pity. It was a masterful performance. And in your professional opinion, Doctor, Pendergast asked, leaning against the railing, is Mrs. Jenkins a danger to her own financial stability? I believe, Eris said, his voice dripping with false concern, that without immediate intervention, the estate will be liquidated by her own hand within the year. She is simply not seeing reality. Judge Vance looked up from his notes. Does the respondent wish to cross-examine? I stood up. I didn't look at Pendergast. I didn't look at Maya. I looked directly at Dr. Eris. Doctor, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. You spoke of reality. Let's discuss yours. Specifically, the reality of your meeting on Friday night with a representative from Palmetto Development. I believe his name is Mr. Thorne, the man who is currently seeking to rezone my property. The courtroom went silent. Maya's pen snapped in her hand. The quiet danger I'd been cultivating was finally out in the light. The first crack in the dam has appeared. When the water starts to rush, there's no stopping the flood. The silence in courtroom, 4B wasn't empty. It was pressurized. Dr. Eris blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from a dark pond. Behind him, Pendergast's professional mask didn't just slip, it shattered. I could see the sweat beginning to bead on the lawyer's upper lip, a salty testament to the fact that they hadn't prepared for a witness who could fight back with facts instead of feelings. I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Jenkins. Eris finally stammered, his voice climbing an octave. I meet with many people. My professional consultations are private. Privacy is a luxury for those with nothing to hide. Doctor, I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs, the ones Mr. Henderson's team had captured at the strip mall. I walked toward the bench, my cane sounding like a gavel with every step. May I approach, Your Honor? Judge Vance nodded, his expression unreadable, though I saw a flicker of something, perhaps pride, in the depths of his dark eyes. I handed him the photos. One by one, he laid them out. Maya, Dr. Eris, and Mr. Thorne huddled over a map of my property in the back of a black SUV. These were taken Friday night. I continued, turning back to the witness stand. At the very moment Maya told me you were reviewing my files at your clinic. Tell me, doctor, does your medical license cover the brokering of real estate deals for developers who specialize in seizing land from the elderly? Objection! Pendergast shouted, standing so quickly his chair screeched against the floor. Relevance! This hearing is about the respondent's mental capacity, not her conspiracy theories. Overruled! Judge Vance rumbled, his voice dropping an octave. He held up one of the photos, showing the thick envelope passing between Thorne and Maya. The credibility of the petitioner's primary expert witness is highly relevant to this court. Sit down, Mr. Pendergast. I turned my gaze to Maya. She was white as a sheet, her hands trembling so violently she had to tuck them under the table. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the devoted granddaughter. I saw the terrified girl who knew the floor was about to give way. Doctor, I said, leaning in close to the witness stand, you testified that I was erratic because I moved my liquid assets. Would you find it erratic to move funds into an escrow account specifically designed to trigger an audit of any third party attempting to access them? Eris looked at Pendergast for help, but Pendergast was busy staring at the ceiling as if he could find an escape hatch there. I wasn't aware of that specific financial structure, Eris whispered. Of course you weren't, I replied, because you were too busy looking at my garden through a developer's lens to notice the security protocols of a woman who spent 30 years managing a school district's budget. You saw a sunset, doctor. You forgot that the stars only come out after the sun goes down. I turned away from him, dismissed him with a flick of my wrist as if he were a fly. I walked back to my seat, but I didn't sit down. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, the weight of 70 years feeling not like a burden, but like armor. Your Honor, I said, addressing the bench. The petitioner claims I am a danger to my own legacy. I would like to submit into evidence the digital recordings from my home security system, the safety system Maya installed herself. It seems she forgot that when you set a trap, you shouldn't leave your own fingerprints on the trigger. The bailiff stepped forward to take the flash drive I held out. Maya let out a small, strangled sound, a whimper of a predator, who realized the cage was now locked from the outside. The truth is a patient thing. Your Honor, I concluded, my voice filling the room with a quiet, undeniable power. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs someone willing to listen. I sat down then. The room was deathly still. The rain finally broke against the courthouse windows, a sudden, violent downpour that washed away the dust of the morning. I looked at the clock on the wall. We were only 20 minutes into the hearing, and the inevitable outcome Maya had dreamed of was already dissolving like sugar in the rain. The court technician fumbled with the laptop, the soft clicking of the keys amplified by the heavy silence of the room. I sat with my hands folded, a statue of composure, while Maya's breathing became a ragged, audible thing beside me. She was staring at the monitor as if it were a guillotine. Video exhibit A, the technician announced. The screen flickered to life, grainy but clear. It was my kitchen, bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the stove's clock. 2:14 a.m. The date stamp showed last Tuesday. On screen, Maya appeared, her face stripped of the sweet granddaughter mask she wore during the day. She was rummaging through my medicine cabinet, her movements frantic and predatory. Where is it? Her recorded voice hissed, sharp enough to make the court reporter flinch. The old bat couldn't have hidden the deed in her sleep. She pulled out a bottle of my blood pressure medication, unscrewing the cap and dumping the pills into her palm. She didn't put them back. She took a small plastic bag from her pocket, swapped my prescribed pills for something else, plain white tablets that looked identical but were nothing more than aspirin, and slid the bottle back into the cabinet with a smirk. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Judge Vance leaned forward, his jaw set so tight I could see the muscles pulsing. "Counsel," the judge said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Does the petitioner wish to explain why she was tampering with the respondent's life-saving medication in the middle of the night?" Pendergast didn't even stand up. He looked at Maya as if she were a sinking ship, and he was the only one without a life vest. "Your Honor, we were unaware of this footage. My client mentioned organizing her grandmother's care, organizing a funeral, more likely," I said softly, not raising my voice, letting the words drift across the aisle like smoke. The video continued. Maya moved to the desk, picking up a pen and practicing a signature on a scrap of paper over and over. Elnora Jenkins. Elnora Jenkins. She was perfecting my loop, the way I cross my T's with a slight downward stroke. It was a chilling display of calculated theft, the kind of coldness that doesn't come from a moment of weakness, but from a lifetime of entitlement. "I've seen enough of that clip," Judge Vance said, waving his hand. "Play the audio file from the car." The technician clicked a second icon. This was the recording from the receiver I'd tucked into Maya's handbag. The sound was muffled by the rustle of fabric, then became crystal clear as she entered her apartment. "He's in, Arthur." Maya's voice rang out, sounding triumphant. "Eris says the mental fog diagnosis is a lock. The developer is offering a bonus if we get the signature by the end of the month. The old woman won't even know she's moved into the facility until the locks are changed on the front door. We'll tell her it's for renovations. She'll be dead within a year of the heartbreak anyway. It's a mercy, really." The audio cut to static. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't pressurized. It was hollow. Maya had collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, desperate sobs. But they weren't the sobs of a repentant heart. They were the tremors of a caught animal. I looked at her, and for a fleeting second, I felt the ghost of the woman who used to braid her hair. But that woman had died the moment Maya decided my life was a line item on a balance sheet. "Your Honor," I said, standing up without the aid of my cane. I let the prop lean against the table. I didn't need it. The weight of the truth was holding me perfectly upright. I believe the question of my mental capacity has been answered. The only thing erratic in this room is the belief that a lifetime of integrity can be erased by a few months of greed. Judge Vance looked at Maya, then at Dr. Eris, who was staring at his own shoes as if trying to wish himself into the floorboards. "This court," the judge began, his voice echoing with the finality of a closing tomb, "is no longer interested in a conservatorship. I am, however, very interested in the criminal statutes regarding elder abuse, forgery, and the solicitation of a bribe." He looked at the bailiff. "Secure the room. No one leaves until the district attorney's office arrives." I sat back down and reached for my handbag. I pulled out a peppermint, unwrapped it slowly, and placed it on my tongue. The sweetness was a sharp contrast to the bitterness that had filled my house for so long. The clicking of the handcuffs was a small, metallic sound, but in the vaulted silence of the courtroom, it sounded like a thunderclap. Two officers moved toward Maya, their faces impassive, their boots echoing on the polished wood. My granddaughter didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply deflated, her expensive gray suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too large for her trembling frame. "Nana, please," she whispered, her voice cracking as they led her toward the side exit. "It was just, I was in over my head. The debt, the people I owed, they were going to hurt me. I didn't blink. I didn't reach out. I watched her the way a scientist watches a specimen under a microscope with a detached, clinical observation. Fear is a poor excuse for cruelty, Maya," I said softly, my voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. "And greed is a poor shield against the law. You didn't just want my money, you wanted my dignity. That is a debt you can't repay with an apology." Beside her, Dr. Eris was being escorted out as well, his hands tucked behind his back, his professional arrogance replaced by a hollow, frantic stare. Pendergast followed them, his briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield, already distance-coding his own involvement in his mind. Judge Vance didn't leave the bench. He watched them go, his expression as stern as a monument. When the doors finally swung shut, leaving only the court staff and me, he let out a long, weary sigh. He looked at me then, not as a judge, but as the boy who used to sit in the front row of my 10th grade English class, the one who'd memorized Langston Hughes just to see me smile. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his voice softening, "I apologize that it came to this. The evidence you provided, it's more than enough for a criminal referral. My clerk is already coordinating with the DA. They'll be at your house this evening to take a formal statement and collect the physical evidence." "Thank you, Silas," I said, using his name for the first time. "I know the law is a blunt instrument, but sometimes it's the only thing that can cut through the rot." I stood up, gathering my things with a slow, methodical grace. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt since before Elijah passed. The weight of the house, the weight of the secrets, the weight of the crazy old woman, mask, it was all gone. As I walked out of the courtroom, the reporters swarmed. The cameras flashed, their artificial lightning illuminating the rain-streaked windows of the hallway. They shouted questions about betrayal and justice and the secret to my resilience. I didn't stop. I didn't give them a soundbite. I walked through the crowd like a ship cutting through a wake. I reached the stone steps and opened my umbrella, a large black silk canopy that shielded me from the world. Mr. Henderson was waiting at the bottom of the steps, holding the door to my sedan open. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply tipped his hat, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done. I drove home through the rain, the windshield wipers keeping a steady, hypnotic beat. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different. The shadows weren't heavy anymore. They were just shadows. The oak trees seemed to stand a little taller. I walked inside, the floorboards creaking a welcome. I went straight to the kitchen, took the special bottle of medication Maya had tampered with, and placed it in a plastic evidence bag. Then I went to the pantry, moved the flour, and pulled out the real ledgers. I sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Not a script, not a confession, but a letter to the Board of Education. There was a scholarship fund I'd been quietly building for years, and it was time to finalize the endowment. Every penny Maya had tried to steal would now go to the children she'd forgotten existed, the ones who needed a leg up, not a handout. Integrity, I whispered, the pen moving smoothly across the paper. It's the only thing they can't take unless you give it to them. The phone rang. I didn't answer it. I knew who it was, the fixer from Palmetto Development, likely calling to see if the transaction had been completed. I let it ring until it stopped. I had one more thing to do before the DA arrived. I walked to the garden, despite the rain, and stood by the hydrangea bush where Maya thought I'd buried the cash. I dug a small hole with my trowel and placed a single silver-backed hairbrush inside, the one Elijah had given me. It was a symbolic burial of the past, of the grief that had made me vulnerable enough for Maya to think she could win. The game was over. The board was clear. And for the first time in 3 years, I was the only one holding the keys. The investigators arrived just as the rain transitioned from a roar to a rhythmic dripping off the eaves. They were polite, hushed, moving through my home with a professional reverence that felt like a funeral for a version of me that never truly existed. I sat at the kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee steaming between us, as a young detective named Miller recorded my statement. He kept looking at me with a mixture of awe and unease, the way people look at a historical monument that suddenly starts speaking. "You kept all of this, Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked, tapping the manila envelope containing the strip mall photos and the ledger of Maya's emergencies. Most people would have confronted her months ago. "Confrontation is for those who seek an apology, detective," I replied, my voice as level as a carpenter's shelf. I was seeking a conclusion. If I had spoken up early, she would have simply changed her tactics. I needed her to believe she was winning, so she would stop looking for the traps I was laying. He nodded, scribbling in his notebook. The medication swap, that's the heavy hitter. Attempted reckless endangerment, maybe more. "We found the aspirin in your cabinet. If you hadn't caught that, you could have had a stroke within weeks." I didn't tell him that I had been testing my pills with a chemical reagent kit I'd ordered under Mr. Henderson's name. I didn't tell him that I'd been watching Maya switch them on the hidden camera while I sipped chamomile tea upstairs. Some secrets are for the law, others are for the soul. By 9 p.m., the house was mine again. The flash drives were booked into evidence, the statements were signed, and the blue envelope from Pendergast was resting in the bottom of my kitchen trash can. I walked through the rooms turning on every lamp. Maya always told me I forgot the lights to make me seem dim-witted. Tonight, I wanted the house to glow like a lighthouse. I ended up in the study, standing before the portrait of Elijah. He looked back at me with that knowing glint in his eyes, the one that said he always knew I was the better strategist of the two of us. I reached out and touched the frame, my fingers tracing the mahogany. She thought she was your granddaughter, Elijah, I whispered, but she forgot she was my student. I sat at the desk and opened the final file, the one Maya never found because it wasn't in a safe or a hidden compartment. It was tucked inside a dusty copy of the Count of Monte Cristo on the highest shelf. It was the deed to the property, but it wasn't just any deed. It was a life estate, structured so that upon my passing, the land would immediately transfer to a nonprofit land trust designated as a historical site for the community's first Black-owned educators' residence. Maya had been trying to steal a house that legally didn't even belong to her future inheritance. She had been chasing a ghost, burning her life down for a pile of bricks that was already promised to the children of this county. The irony was the only thing that made me smile that night. I heard a soft knock at the back door. It was Mr. Henderson. He looked tired, his coat damp from the lingering mist. He didn't come in. He just stood on the porch, a silent sentinel who had been my eyes when I needed to remain blind. The developer pulled their bid. Elnora, he said, Thorne is being questioned. Word is, they're looking into every deal he's made with Dr. Eris over the last 5 years. You didn't just save your house. You opened a very big, very ugly box. The box was already there, Arthur. I said, I just took the lid off. He nodded once. You need anything else? I can stay in the guest room if you're feeling uneasy. Uneasy? I chuckled, a low, dry sound. Arthur, for the first time in years, I know exactly where everyone is. Maya is in a cell, the doctor is in a precinct, and I am in my kitchen. I haven't felt this easy in decades. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the night. I locked the door, not out of fear, but out of habit, and walked upstairs. My knees didn't ache as much as they usually did. The air felt cleaner. The news broke the following morning like a fever that refused to pass. I sat on my porch, a cardigan pulled tight against the damp air, watching the world react to the ruins of Maya's ambition. The headlines were sensational. Socialite granddaughter charged in elder abuse plot, and the teacher who taught the court a lesson. They loved the drama of it, the fallen star, the disgraced doctor, the predatory developer. But they missed the quiet center of the story. They missed the woman who had simply refused to be erased. By noon, a black town car pulled into the driveway. I didn't recognize the driver, but the man who stepped out of the back seat was unmistakable. It was Mr. Thorne, the head of Palmetto Development. He didn't look like a fixer today. He looked like a man who had spent the night watching his empire sprout leaks. He walked up the path, his steps hesitant on the gravel. I didn't stand. I didn't offer him a chair. I simply watched him from behind my tea, a spectator at his unraveling. Mrs. Jenkins, he began, his voice strained, stripped of its corporate polish. I believe there's been a catastrophic misunderstanding. My firm was led to believe by your granddaughter that you were seeking a transition. We had no knowledge of her extracurricular methods. I set my cup down with a slow, deliberate precision. Mr. Thorne, a man in your position doesn't have misunderstandings. You have calculated risks. You risked your reputation on the word of a woman who was bleeding her own grandmother dry. That speaks more to your character than to her competence. I'm here to make it right, he said, leaning forward. We're prepared to offer a significant donation to your scholarship fund. In exchange, perhaps we could release a joint statement, something about collaborative community growth. I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw the same hollow greed that had consumed Maya. He thought everyone had a price. He thought the truth was a commodity you could buy back if the market turned. My scholarship fund is built on the sweat of honest people, Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous hum. It doesn't need the shadow of your conscience to grow. You didn't come here to make it right. You came here to make it go away. But some stains don't wash out. They just soak deeper into the fabric. He stiffened, the benevolent businessman, mask finally cracking. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Jenkins. I have friends in the State House. This incident can be a headline today and a footnote tomorrow. Don't make an enemy out of a man who can build a highway through your backyard. I stood up, and for the first time, I let him see the full, unyielding weight of my 70 years. I've survived Jim Crow, Mr. Thorne. I've survived the loss of a husband who was a giant among men. I've survived the betrayal of my own blood. Do you really think a highway frightens me? I've spent my life teaching children how to read the maps you try to hide. You're not a builder. You're a scavenger. And today, the meat is off the bone. I pointed toward the driveway. Get off my property. And tell your friends in the State House that I've already sent a copy of our little chat to Judge Vance's personal clerk. I believe they call it tampering with a witness in your world. He turned on his heel and practically ran to his car. I watched the dust settle behind him, a satisfying grit in the air. He was a small man in a large suit, a shadow that had forgotten it only existed because of the light. I went back inside and called Mr. Henderson. Arthur, I said, it's time for the final piece. Have the surveyor come out tomorrow. I want the borders of the land trust marked clearly. I want the world to know exactly where my legacy begins and their greed ends. It's done, Elnora, he replied. And by the way, the DA called. Maya is asking for a meeting. She says she'll tell them everything about Thorne and Eris if you'll just agree to speak to her. I looked at the empty chair where Maya used to sit, the one she'd used to practice her concerned face. Tell them she can speak to the wall? Arthur, I'm busy living in a house that finally belongs to me again. The final day of March arrived with a stillness that felt like a benediction. I spent the morning in the kitchen, not with ledgers or recording devices, but with a bowl of fresh lemons and a bag of sugar. The air was sweet, free of the medicinal tang of the pills Maya had tried to feed me. My house was no longer a battlefield. It was a home again, reclaimed by the simple act of existing within it on my own terms. A week had passed since the hearing. Maya's name was still in the papers, but the stories had shifted. They were no longer about her devotion, but about the intricate web of debt and deception she'd woven across 3 states. Dr. Eris had surrendered his license in a desperate plea deal, and Mr. Thorne's development firm was under a federal audit that promised to strip the gilding off his every skyscraper. Justice, I found, isn't a lightning bolt. It's a slow, steady rain that eventually drowns the weeds. I walked out to the garden, carrying a glass of lemonade. The sun was warm on my shoulders, a gentle weight that didn't feel like a burden. Near the hydrangea bush, the surveyor's stakes stood tall, tied with bright orange ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. They were the new borders, not of a cage, but of a sanctuary. I sat on the stone bench Elijah had built for our 40th anniversary. From here, I could see the high school in the distance, the place where I had spent 30 years convincing children that their voices mattered more than the world's silence. It felt right that this land would eventually belong to them. It felt like the final period at the end of a very long, very complicated sentence. My phone chimed in my pocket, a text from Mr. Henderson. The transfer is official. The Elnora Jenkins Land Trust is recorded. You're a legend, Elnora. I smiled, but I didn't reply. I wasn't a legend. I was just a woman who had been paying attention. I was a woman who knew that the world often mistakes silence for weakness and age for irrelevance. They forget that a forest doesn't scream as it grows. It simply waits until its roots are deep enough to hold the earth. I finished my lemonade and looked at the silver-backed brush I'd unburied from the garden. I'd cleaned the dirt from the bristles, the silver shining once more in the afternoon light. It was a reminder that even the things we bury can be restored if they were made of the right material to begin with. The doorbell rang, a soft, melodic chime. I didn't rush. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps firm and rhythmic on the hardwood. I didn't need the cane today, but I kept it by the door, a reminder of the role I'd played so perfectly. I opened the door to find a young girl standing there, perhaps 18, with a backpack slung over her shoulder and a look of fierce determination in her eyes. She was one of the first recipients of the new scholarship, a girl named Sarah who wanted to study law. "Mrs. Jenkins," she asked, her voice steady but respectful. "I just wanted to thank you. They told me what you did, how you fought for the fund. I wanted to know if you had any advice for someone just starting out." I looked at her, seeing the same fire that used to burn in Silas Vance, the same fire that had kept me upright in a courtroom filled with liars. I reached out and patted her hand, my touch light but certain. "Watch the hands, Sarah," I said, my voice a low, wise hum. "People will tell you anything with their mouths, but their hands will always tell you the truth. And never, ever let someone convince you that your silence is a sign of your absence. Sometimes silence is just the sound of a plan coming together." She nodded, a small, knowing smile spreading across her face. I watched her walk down the driveway, her head held high, a new legacy beginning before the old one had even finished its tea. I went back inside and closed the door. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. The game was over. The board was put away. And for the first time in 70 years, I didn't have to look over my shoulder to see who was following me. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The best revenge isn't loud. It's living long enough to see the truth win. The story is told, the garden is quiet, and the light is finally staying on.